Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week we're going to talk about a bird from New Caledonia called the Kagu. Before we get into the episode, we want to thank everyone that has left a review on our podcast app. If you haven't yet, please do so because this really helps us out. Okay, so for the Kagu, we have a lot to get into. This episode is very interesting because although you may not have heard of this bird, Shannon has done a lot of work with it and has a lot to teach us. This episode also shows off one of the things that I like the most about our podcast, how Shannon and John both bring very different high-level perspectives, so you get to see two different thoughts on the ways that this bird has evolved to be so unique. And unique is an understatement for this bird. It's super cool. Okay, go grab your binoculars, let's head to New Caledonia and get into it. So New Caledonia, it's a group of islands in the Southwest Pacific. So it's 750 miles east of Australia. So another close island would be like Vanuatu, 140 miles southwest of Vanuatu. So really kind of in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. The mainland is divided by a mountain range that's like 5,000 feet. So it's kind of created really unique microclimates in there. It's like this tropical climate. And so I saw that New Caledonia has many unique taxa, especially birds and plants, and is one of the richest biodiversity in the world per square kilometer. So just kind of setting the table for talking about the Kagu. So before we get into the bird, just kind of wanted to set up where we're going to New Caledonia.
Yeah, I think we should talk about that just a little more. So one of the crazy things about New Caledonia from being out in the Pacific, where there are lots of islands, is it's one of the largest islands. It's much larger than most of the other Pacific islands. And it's on a different geologic plate than New Zealand and Australia. And so historically, it was connected up with the Australian plate at some point, but then has been drifting away for something like 65 million years. So it's a really old piece of land in that sense, which is why it's got so many endemic plants. But from a bird standpoint, it actually doesn't have very many. And I think that's probably because it's such a small island that what gets there are a whole bunch of birds for the most part, with the exception of Kagu and a few other things. Everything has to fly there in order to colonize it. And so the rest of the species on New Caledonia are things that are derived from places like Australia and New Zealand, which are still a long ways away. But the Kagu isn't like that.
Yeah.
And that's what's so amazing about it.
It's one of the most unique birds. That's why I picked it, because, something, again, most people probably have never heard of. But if you want to see amazing bird videos, you will look at bird videos of this Kagu to see how it actually moves through the landscape and what its behaviors are like. And it's really adorable when it's running around. And it's really taxonomically really unique. It's the only thing that's in its family. And it has so many unique features, but then it shares features with what a bunch of different kinds of data have shown to be its closest living relative, which is the Sunbittern, which is found in the New World tropics. So if you look at a globe and think of this Kagu in New Caledonia, and then you think of the thing it's most closely related to is in the New World tropics in Central and South America. So that is a extremely weird distribution. And I always hypothesize, and so do a bunch of other scientists, that it used to be a much larger radiation, of which all of the members have gone extinct, because it makes no sense to have those two things and not other representatives in other continents.
So how could that be?
Did it come from this time when a lot of continents were together in something called Gondwana land, and then stayed on this landmass as it separated, and then went extinct everywhere, but in New Caledonia and the New World tropics? So it's really fascinating from that perspective how these birds might have come to be the as distinct as they are, and where they are, and whether or not fossils will ever fill in pieces of that picture as we know more and more about the world. So that would be my prediction, is that eventually you'll find fossils that will be attributable to that lineage of birds that are now extinct on other continents.
That's so cool.
And you'll see this bird in zoos. We have 4 of them only in our collection, and they're all zoo birds. So it seems to live pretty well in zoos. And so its species name is Rhinochetus, and its genus name, and its species name is Jubatus. Its scientific name means nose. So the Rhinochetus thing has to do with a nose, which is also pretty interesting.
And they have a pretty unique nose, right? Or nostrils?
They do.
Is it? And so what exactly is it that it's called corns?
Yeah. They have these like knobby kind of protuberancy things. Well, I don't know about knobby, but they're almost, people describe them as hairs, but they're not. It's keratin. But they do look weird. So they're not hairs. Birds don't have hairs. So they're modified feathers that come out, and they're stiff. They also have soft feathers too on the back of their heads and their crests. So they've kind of evolved all different kinds of feathers to be part of their displays.
The corns like block so things don't come into their nostrils?
Well, I read
Is that what the
but
purpose that they serve, or do we know?
I mean, lots of birds that are on the ground don't have that. So are they doing something really all that different from other birds? Maybe. That's what they said. And it's, it's an obvious thing to think. But, sometimes if you're evolving independently for tens of millions of years, stuff happens, right?
Yeah, but I
don't all have to have a
would argue
function.
I would argue stuff happens for a reason.
No, it doesn't. It
And
happens. Mutations don't happen for a reason.
So it's a really interesting, they've been isolated out there with the insect fauna and the gecko fauna. There these other groups that have gotten out there, and so it's it's possible that maybe some of the food they eat is actually more problematic on New Caledonia than it would be some other place.
Maybe.
That's my hypothesis.
I don't agree. The Jubatus part means it's Latin for crested. So that makes, or maned, which is interesting because cheetah has that same kind of last name. It's the species name. So if you do a search for Jubatus, you'll find a lot of information about the cheetah, with people are like, why the heck did they use that word for the cheetah? But, and I don't know the answer to that one either, but it makes sense to use something about, a crest or a mane for this bird. But, cheetahs aren't lions. So where's the connection to a mane or a crest? I have no idea why. And these birds are flightless. So they, and that has evolved a bunch of times on islands because in theory, there are fewer predators. So you can make a living being on the ground without being nearly as fearful. So you'll see them walking around. They also have bright red eyes, which is pretty cool of them too. And when they're displaying, you see them upright. They run around kind of like parrots, right? Very, very, very upright. They have these bizarre displays where they raise their crests at each other and kind of dance back and forth with each other and chase one another. I mean, if you wanted to make a stuffed animal, and especially if you wanted to make an animatronic one, it wouldn't get much cuter than a Kagu, because the videos are just absolutely sweet.
So one of the things that Shannon didn't mention is that the way they figured all this out was she was involved in this large project to sequence all the orders and families of birds, and Kagu and Sunbittern hadn't been put together until they actually started analyzing.
There had been suggestions of it, but it wasn't something people believed until a large enough data matrix is put together to show that relationship, while old, is very strongly supported.
But, as she said, like the biogeography of this is completely wild in the sense of South America and this island far off the coast of Australia and New Zealand. And yet one of the things that I remember looking at was photos online of Kagu.
Yeah, we did that once we realized the relationships. It's like, okay, let's go look at these things in more detail. And your dad, John, sent me a postcard. And that's the thing that triggered me into paying attention to what its relatives are. So I have in my office, I have this postcard that John's dad sent me of a Kagu with its wings spread. And if you look at its wings, they call it the ghost bird. Well, because it's gray, but it also has this kind of ghosty pattern on its wings that you only see when its wings are exposed like that.
And that behavior is actually something that these sunbitterns in South America are famous for. So they have they're these brown, incredibly beautifully patterned birds, but they have the same habit that the Kagus do of spreading their wings, and they have these whiter markings along parts of the wings. And so it's hard to know whether that's a shared characteristic, but it's really
They look
striking that
extremely
they
similar.
both do
So
it.
if you look at the outspread wings of a sunbittern, and then you kind of, if you took a picture of it and then kind of cut back on the color, you would exactly match what a Kagu's wings look like. It's just kind of a ghosted pattern of the thing that the sunbitterns have, and other birds don't have that. So these are unique characteristics that they share. That once you know the tree of life and you know that those birds are each other's closest relatives, then you can start asking questions about where that ghosting pattern comes from, because it could come from the shared ancestral history of these two lineages, as opposed to being independently derived across them. Like if we go back to the double-crested cormorant, look, the morphology of those birds never got a tree of life that made any sense, and because there's so few characters that vary that they, the characters that people could describe did not match at all what the DNA data were telling you about the relationships. That makes it a tough go until you have something solid to base your interpretation of the other characteristics that they have, a solid tree of life. But that's what this tree of life gave us, was the ability to kind of look at the patterns that these birds have, whether they're behavioral or physical on their wings or feathers, and ask questions about, do they do this same thing the same way? I don't know the answer to that completely yet, because we don't know how. We just know that there is a pattern and something that you should look at, and that's what trees give you, is a refined ability to look at why things look the way they do, why they're, I mean, in this case, the geography wouldn't tell you anything about what its closest living relative, because that would be a bizarre hypothesis to put out, that this endemic bird in New Caledonia is closest living relatives, and then the New World tropics. That makes zero sense.
Yeah, for sure.
So, but the tree tells you gives you the insight into a lot of other things that you can then look at. That's why I love trees so much. I mean, if you look at your own family tree, people are so interested in why they look the way they do. Do they have a sense of humor like their parents? Is their hair, like their parents? Are their behaviors like their parents? And that's all nested in the tree of life. So the power of DNA and relationships to help you interpret the way the world works. And that's something people are fascinated with. That's why 23andMe has so many things, and Ancestry.com has so many people on it, because they're all searching for kind of the meaning of life. And to me, that what this relationship does is it showed me very dramatically that probably the most profound thing in my life that I think of, guiding principle, which is going to sound super weird, is that all life on Earth is connected through the molecule of DNA by the process of ancestry and descent. So the same process and the same molecule that connects you to your parents, your grandparents, your children, that connects you to everything that's ever lived on Earth from its inception, for some odd billion years ago. And to me, that's profound, that you're not separate. You're part of the tree of life. Humans always want to think they're separate at the end of the ladder of life. I don't. I just think of us as one species with an outsized effect on the environment, but we're one species, not even a very old one at that, and not a very diverse one from the perspective of DNA. So, if you think of yourself, the way you value your family, the way your tree tells you to value your family, I think that value should spread to all life on Earth, because you are connected to it. You are not independent. But that thing was highlighted with this particular set of relations to me really dramatically, just how fun it is to know what relationships are and how many doors that opens to the next steps in trying to figure out the way things are.
Shannon, what you said made me think of something I saw recently. There's a show on HBO that's been out called Chimp Crazy, and it's about people that
Oh,
have chimps as pets and everything. It's
uh,
kind of an insane story, but they talked about there's a lot of people there that are fascinated with chimps and talk about how humans share 98% of DNA, or I forget the exact amount, with chimps, and they argue that that's why they're closer with chimps. And the person telling the story makes the counter argument, well, we actually share 96% with like a rat, or
yeah.
it's like we may be so close to chimps, but we're also so close to so many other things. And what you were talking about right now just made me think of that, like that, we're not so far off from all of these different animals. Um,
Well, it's
and I really liked what you said there as far as like that we really are all connected.
it's really true because that tree of life for primates, for example, has taught us a lot of the things we used to think were uniquely human, whether that is an opposable thumb or whatever it is. It's actually really hard to define what a human is. So when you start thinking about all these things you think are uniquely human and you start stepping back through the tree of life for primates, you'll find that most of these characteristics evolved somewhere before humans split from chimps. So they might be really highly modified in humans, but they didn't originate there. So the tree tells us kind of the accumulation of differences that eventually lead to humans, but humans are still primates. So they still share all of those characteristics as you step back in the tree of life. So we're not special. We're not unique in most ways. I mean, you share 50% of your DNA with a banana. So, hey, you're made of
I'm
cells. The
still
cells divide.
I'm still going to argue that the corns on bills of Kagu are special to Kagus.
Yeah, they are unique to Kagu, but that doesn't mean that they have a purpose. Do you think everything in you has a purpose? Yeah,
Absolutely.
right. Well, humans have really bad backs because they didn't originate upright. So the upright posture leads to a whole bunch of problems with your back that if you hunched over as your ancestors did, wouldn't leave you in the same condition. So we're all combinations of things that are unique, either unique to you as an individual or unique to the species you belong or family of organisms that you belong to and stuff like that. So nothing is perfectly adapted. Even a human eye, these are not perfectly adapted things. They, again, are the result of variation that happens and selection that happens and land changes and population changes and all these kinds of things that lead you to the evolution of life on Earth. So nothing is perfectly adapted, and that includes humans, even though they don't like to think about it. Sorry, humans, we're not special.
But they did get to New Caledonia and create a lot of problems for Kagus.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we should go back to Kagus. I should get off my soapbox. But yeah, you should really look at videos of them behaving. And like a lot of birds that have evolved on islands before humans got there, they're pretty tame at some level. So if you see videos, you'll almost always see a human foot in them or something else kind of provoking certain kinds of behavior.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like they're very like we saw some of those same videos where there's like a person kind of has their foot out and it's getting the bird to spread its wings out, and it doesn't seem like they're very afraid of anything.
Well, they didn't have a reason to. There are
Yeah.
not that many predators till humans got
Yeah.
there. Brought rats, cats, dogs, and other things. Then they have things to worry about, right? If you nest on the ground and someone brings a cat in, you're in big old honkin' trouble.
I was wondering, their white or light gray color, is that like we know they evolved having no predators, but is that some type of camouflage or did they not need any camouflage? And then why would they be that color?
Yeah, John, what's the adaptive value of being gray in that environment?
Now I'm going to tell my story, not that it's true.
Okay.
So, I mean, part of it is Shannon's right. In this case, they could be probably any color. Although one of the things that's interesting is I think on a lot of these island situations, you don't see like the evolution of really wild, bright colors necessarily just because
Go to Hawaii.
I guess the birds. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. So, with Kagu, I mean, one of the things is I wonder whether the soil's really light and maybe
I don't don't.
I know. I'm storytelling.
Yeah, you certainly
I
are.
don't think they had. I don't think they had any predators till humans got there.
I mean,
for the most part.
if you watch videos of them, when they're trying to capture prey, so they're carnivorous. They eat lots of different kinds of animals, but they don't eat plants in that way, or not on purpose anyway. But they run, and they often stand with one leg kind of up in the air when they run, and then they stab things with their beak. So, I mean, the speculation is that they run around, then they stop, and they're still for several seconds while they're listening to see if they hear the rustling of something under the leaves and other things like that. And then they will stick their pointy beak and stab something and eat it.
So I read that their crest that they have, it's like a sensory organ, and they have nerve endings in it, and they actually use it to feel.
Yeah.
Like, is that common? Are there other birds? I've never
We
heard of
don't-
that in a bird before, but wasn't sure.
I mean, we don't know. I mean, they don't know exactly what the function of the nerves that go into these crests are. So that's, again, we should have Marquart back on, because that's one of the things she's studying for her dissertation is the evolution of crests. And believe it or not, we know almost nothing about how crests originated or even what their functions are sometimes. So a lot of crests are likely to have nerves and muscles in them, because that's would be part of the using of them in any display, right? You have to have a nerve and a muscle in order to manipulate the thing. But so what exactly does it do there? That's an interesting question that I think is unknown until we start knowing more about what a crest is, what they look like, how the feathers attach to the skull, which, again, these are all things that we don't know very much about. Is it a sensory organ? You can make the case that you could hypothesize that it is because of the nerves there, but that doesn't mean it actually is in the way that you think of it. That requires more study.
But it would be interesting to figure out, because it very well might. And to me, the place that it would be completely possible, or to me imaginable, that in a situation where you're on this island and evolving separately from your closest ancestors for 20 plus million years, and it's a forested situation where you're hunting all these different types of prey, that maybe that is useful.
It could be. I just don't. I don't know. We need more context of crests to understand whether that thing is just like every other crest or whether it does something unique, and we don't have enough basic data yet to know that. So again, these birds are adorably cute. They live in extended family groups. They're monogamous, although I'm not sure I don't know how much cheating there is, but they're helpers. So they have what's called cooperative breeding, where the younger birds can hang around for many years. But those birds, apparently, they help defend things, but they do not feed the latest baby.
So I was wondering when I read that, I was wondering whether maybe what happens there is there's some issues with population density. And so I think a lot of times young birds will disperse if they can find places to disperse to find other Kagus. But if everywhere they go, they find mated Kagus that drive them off, for instance, because they're not family members, and then you may hang around to help just because you're waiting for an opportunity to find some space that you can actually get to.
If we're going to anthropomorphize, they only lay one egg. So maybe the paired bird is the ultimate helicopter parents. If they're going to put all of that reproductive effort into one egg only with each breeding attempt, maybe they keep the other ones around because they want to maximize their fitness. So you can maximize your fitness in a lot of ways. You can stick a bunch of offspring, like ducks do, into the environment. And so if you put 12 out and only one survives, okay, you need to put 12 out. But if you're only going to put one out, you have to put a lot of energy into that one, or your reproductive output won't support the species. So I don't know, maybe the parents do that because they really are trying to. This is all anthropomorphic, right? So
I think the changes in the landscape in New Caledonia may have a major impact on some of that. In other words, they're down to sort of isolated populations across the island that are pretty small. And so I would go the direction of arguing that those changes more recently might be dictating some of this more than
I don't know, but
actual
they
fitness.
only lay one egg, so that has behavioral consequences to only lay one egg.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that because they don't have any predation, haven't had any predation for millions of years, they also don't need to have much in the way of parental care, even because what's going to happen to the chick?
Maybe so,
With an interesting so an interesting New Caledonia contrast to this is the crows on New Caledonia are considered to be
oh
some of the best problem solvers known in the bird
yeah,
world,
Oh, cool.
and it's like, why?
yeah. Well, a
Yeah.
Kagu should be afraid of a crow
Of a
because
crow.
those crows will figure them out in no time. They also have powder down in them, and I don't know why they would. People say it helps to clean and dry, but that didn't. I don't. I don't know if I believe this. You guys are getting insight into what our house is like every day. These kinds of conversations, aren't we? Super boring. John and I live like this
No,
all the
this is
time. Oh my
fascinating.
god! It just dawned on me how similar this is to things we were talking about before we got on, and things we'll talk about later on. Things we talk about in the car. Oh my! And they vocally mimic other birds too, which is pretty interesting. And that's I don't know the purpose of that, or they do that just because they can. They also have large eyes, which is not an uncommon thing of things that live near the ground. If you live under the ground, or like really in the ground, sometimes you lose your eyes, or they get smaller and smaller and smaller because you adapt to use other things like smell or touch to feed. But I guess there's an intermediate stage there where your eyes will get bigger so that you do have the ability to see maybe a little bit better.
And then I saw that they have their preen gland is near the base of the tail, or there's something where they have a unique scent where they
Yeah.
mark their territory.
Well,
I
rats
was
do that
wondering,
too, right?
yeah,
But yeah, that's
is that a common? I mean, are there other birds that do that?
maybe the ones that
So
live on the ground.
I was going to say, I'll bet kiwis and things like that are really
Octopus.
terrestrial oriented.
Okay, I
Yeah.
thought that was so interesting.
Yeah. So their status is interesting to me too. That a lot of isolated birds are considered super, super vulnerable, but these ones are not, because there's roughly 1,000 birds, and the scientists think that populations have been fairly stable. So it doesn't get the same endangered status that, a lot of birds on Hawaii might. I don't think there's like tremendous population declines, although there probably were until once the Europeans got there with themselves and their habitat destruction and their cats and dogs and things like that.
Yeah, I wonder whether things like mongoose which have been introduced into Hawaii, or there's some predators that may not exist in New Caledonia in the numbers that they're in Hawaii.
What is like the conservation like in New Caledonia? Is their government pretty helpful as far as looking out for things like that? Do we know?
I think what you see in almost any of these islands is the same kinds of things you'd see in the U.S. sometimes, where they're competing factors all the time.
Yeah,
I think people have recognized the uniqueness, the residents have recognized the uniqueness of the flora and fauna in New Caledonia. So there are definitely protected areas that are better managed than they were previously. But they're fragmented, and one of the things you worried about in these situations is, as climates change, are those areas going to be able to persist in the areas where they are over thousands of years? I mean, that's the interesting thing to me about some of these things is, what's the prognosis for these habitats now that they've been fragmented, these forests that the birds like, the Kagus like in New Caledonia? If they're fragmented much more than they were historically, is that going to stand the test of a big climate event in the way that it might have 20 million years ago, or 15 million years ago, or 10 million years ago?
I think, though, there is difference in the ethos associated with different parts of the world and different cultures with conservation. And we saw that when we did the Puteki-Teki in New Zealand, which has a very strong sense of preservation of species. And to me, that differs a bit from the U.S. I don't want to be too mean about the U.S., and so, if the indigenous people in areas are connected, does that ethos of conservation kind of go with the people in that sense? And I don't know, Kagus are revered by indigenous New Caledonians. Ghost bird of the forest, it's called.
Well, and as I said from the beginning, I mean, it's a fascinating place. The number of birds there is actually fairly small. It's about 145 species, and it's, if you think about it, a lot of those are seabirds. A lot of them are rails and things like that are just good dispersers. Kingfishers, as we'll talk about at some point, which get around the Polynesian islands. And then you've got this bird like Kagu, which has clearly been there on its own for a very, very long period of time.
I meant to listen to them, but I didn't. Apparently they can, their conservation status would probably be worse if there were a lot of people on New Caledonia, which there aren't, because apparently they sing obnoxiously for like 15 minutes in the morning, and it just annoys the heck out of people who are around them. So I think what is it like having a chicken, a rooster in your neighborhood?
Oh man,
I don't know.
That's awesome.
So the interesting thing to me about that is that there's a bird in an interesting family. They're called Seriemas in South America that live in these family groups, and there's one that looks essentially, this red-billed Seriema looks like a skinny Kagu, in my opinion. And they do the same thing. These groups just have this really raucous call that the whole group does. Yeah, I can imagine that getting pretty old pretty fast if you were trying to sleep.
Maybe that's how they've adapted to predators. The Kagu, they're like, people can't live near.
Well,
yeah,
maybe it's
so obnoxious.
The sweet kind of
So
helicopter
annoying.
parent isn't right, because they do send their chicks out to defend the territory. So maybe they're sacrificial lambs like that.
Oh no.
I don't know.
Well, I think we're getting close on time. Is there anything else on the Kagu we want to talk about before we get into the mailbag?
You got to love YouTube.
Yeah.
Seriously, I mean,
Yeah.
it enables people you can travel to New Caledonia through the internet in a way that I think is profoundly interesting and relevant for people.
Yeah, we looked at a ton of videos earlier. It's so exciting to be able to watch that.
And it's got some beautiful places for sure. It's a spectacular island.
I mean, I couldn't travel as a kid, right? I didn't grow up with, my family didn't have much money. We had a history of camping, but, not a history of staying in hotels or anything like that, and not in a plane for sure. So the idea that, if I were a kid now, I would have so many more resources than just picture books of birds to travel the world through. But those resources are really, really important for people to connect to different places and different peoples through, the awe that you can have with what humans can do, or the awe that you can have with what nature has produced through the evolutionary process. So you don't have to travel to be well-traveled.
All right. Well, should we get into the mailbag question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Okay. So this says, hello. I'm a relatively new listener, and I've been listening from the start forward. I just finished episode 23, where your mailbag question was about feathers. I just wanted to write in and tell you about the rehab I volunteer at. We are called Liberty Wildlife, located in Phoenix, Arizona, and we have a program called the Non-Eagle Feather Repository, or NEFR. This program was started to allow indigenous people the ability to have feathers used in their ceremonies. We collect feathers from our birds, as well as receive donations from across the country of feathers and deceased birds. Our team catalogs them and fulfills orders for specific feather shapes, types, and species. It is completely free for indigenous people. If I am remembering numbers correctly, last year we supplied feathers to more than 300 people across 80 tribes. Last I heard, we are the only non-eagle repository in the country, and there is one eagle feather repository in Colorado. If people find feathers on the ground of migratory raptors and want to send them in, the information is on our website, and I can post the website Thank you so much for your wonderful show. I have learned a lot and love passing the info on when I am doing educational tours and working with our education ambassadors. Keep up the great work. And this is from Sosa.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's neat. I mean, this is something that bird feathers are really important in indigenous culture. And I love the fact that they've come up with a way to obtain them in ways that allow them to get them out to people. They mentioned that eagle feathers are, because there's actually legislation to protect eagles, and such that you need very, very special permits. And the primary impetus for that was recognizing the importance of eagle feathers in Native American culture. And so this is a sustainable use of feathers that the birds aren't using because they molt them every year. And that's usually why you end up finding them, and why not reuse them? I love the idea that they're actually doing that.
When you think about the trauma that European cultures wreaked as they moved all over the world for fashion. So there's a lot of birds that are protected in the U.S. because their feathers were very valuable for whether it's women's hats or other aspects of fashion. And that made a lot of birds, herons, almost get hunted to extinction for that, such that that's why Avery Island in Louisiana with the Tabasco McElhaney family, that's why that preserve exists, is to try to give a refuge for some of these birds. There are laws now that protect that, but to recognize that you don't have to sacrifice a bird in order to get feathers for cultural opportunities and to continue your culture down using things that are naturally harvested, sustainably harvested, actually is really important. It just takes people to do it. People have to know about it. They have to know where they can put feathers. And they have to recognize also that only certain people can have feathers, at least in North America, of migratory birds. They're protected for those reasons. We don't want to hunt things to extinction because we like their feathers. So there are places, but you don't personally should not have your own feather collection. These people have permits. They have the lawful ability to have these feathers and to use them in this way. You as a person do not. So I know that sounds kind of judgy, but you just have to be careful. Not that I think the conservation organizations, federal organizations are going to come after you or anything like that. But you have to be really careful with the things that you keep from wildlife, even ones that you might find dead on the road or something like that. You're not allowed to lawfully possess birds, most birds.
Yeah, I'm glad that they reached out. Amanda and I have gone to a couple different things, both in Colorado and in Illinois, supporting like indigenous cultures. And I think it's an important thing to preserve. So it seems like this is like a really good organization that does that in a sustainable way where it's not, like you mentioned, doing anything harmful to birds.
I think it's important to connect those agencies to those organizations and people to the museum, because when we know that people are looking for certain things to use in that, then we have the permission to have these feathers, right? We have the permission to pick them up, and we can help with some of these efforts. So, but only if you know.
All right. Well, thank you for sending that in.
Yeah.
We'll post the link to that in the show notes, just in case anybody wants to look into it. Anything else we want to touch on? John, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah. So New Caledonia is about as far away as you can get. And as Shannon was saying earlier, go online, check it out, and maybe go there and see a Kagu, because it's an incredible bird and an incredible part of the world.
Or go to a zoo that has one. That's, you can travel without physically going places. And in fact, humans maybe shouldn't go to some places where we want the environments to stay wild. And anyways, but there are other ways of learning and going.
Thanks everyone for joining us this week. We appreciate all of you. If you have a question for us, you can reach us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Please follow us on our socials as well. We're on Instagram and TikTok, and all of our episodes are uploaded to YouTube as well. Okay, Love you all. See you all next week.